First of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you for sharing your morning with me. I want to thank Strategy as Practice Division for inviting me to this talk. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm going to be mentioning a number of my papers, so I want to thank my co-authors for giving me great people to work with to help me to do research. And a special thanks to Anne and Sarah who are going to comment. Maybe I shouldn't thank them first. I should do what I say, but I figure this kind of occasion they're only going to say the nice stuff, so whatever. Anyway, thank you. There you go. What's the agenda this morning? I'm going to talk a little bit philosophically about what I think about rigorous and relevant research. I'm going to be somewhat autobiographical in the sense of talking about what for me personally, perhaps not for you, but for me personally, have led to research that I think is strategy as practice. And then maybe do a little bit of fortune telling about what I think some of the exciting areas of research are going forward in strategy as practice. So that's where we're going. First of all, the idea of rigor versus relevance. I don't know how many of you this has occurred to, but in parts of our field, broadly defined, people tend to think of rigor and relevance as ends of a continuum. You are either rigorous or you are relevant, but you aren't both. And that was certainly true in my doctoral training at Stanford. I can think of certain schools around the country where there's that point of view. And sometimes when you're doing something that's relevant, even if it's rigorous, it's somehow second class because you talk to managers and you cared about that. And in contrast to that point of view of rigor and relevance or ends of a dimension, I think they're orthogonal. I think you can have rigorous research that says nothing to real managers, and you have relevant research that's kind of marginal from a rigor point of view. But I think they are two different dimensions, and you can be both. You can be both rigorous and relevant. And moreover, I think the very best research is rigorous and relevant. It really is the very best research. It is being published in an A-level journal, and is also coming out in HBR or The Economist or in a book that's talking to practitioners. So I think it's easy to cop out for the rigor guys and say, well, but it's okay to be irrelevant because we're rigorous. And it's really not. I think particularly if you're sitting in business school, it's your job to be relevant. If you can't be, you should be in a social department or an income department, and sort of make that choice. So that's something I actually feel pretty passionate about. So when Tommy and Ann asked me to speak, there was my opportunity to say that point, which is an important point to me. So the idea that rigor and relevance are really two separate things, and they're the best research is both. Also, just I'm trying to think, what is rigor and relevant research, and then going beyond that, what is strategy as practice, which is a more refined notion. And I think, to me, performance has to be central. It may not be the dependent variable, and you may be able to infer performance, but there's got to be something about performance in there. I think the data have to be granular enough so you can actually see what real people are doing, which really is strategy as practice. And I'm trying to think of a situation where it wasn't longitudinal. And there may be ways to be not longitudinal, but I think kind of inherently rigorous and relevant research and more specifically strategy as practice are longitudinal. And then the research question has to have some sort of practical importance. So that's sort of the overview of soapbox kind of things. That's I guess the wrap to that. Strategy as practice is relevant, is certainly relevant, and often it is. What I want to go next was talk a little bit about autobiographically of where my own work has come from, and what if there's some sort of a pattern to that. I think one way that one can be, and use that my own experience to talk about what's strategy as practice and what kinds of research might drive strategy as practice. And so I'm going to talk about practical problems, cool company, switching the usual lens, and unpacking the process. And those are, at least for me, the four ways that I've been able to think about it. As I thought about work, let's say from Anne or from Sarah, I think they're coming from that convention as well, both of those conventions. Let me just talk about practical problems. And Tony mentioned one of my early papers, which was the fast decision-making papers. And what that paper had a high degree of luck to it. But what it did, I think, when I was writing that paper, it was incredibly important to practitioners of how to be fast. You know, it was great to be effective, efficient, and things like that. But if you weren't fast, the train left the station. And so it was an enormously practical problem. And people didn't have an idea of how to actually be fast. You know, okay, you flip a coin, you roll dice, you throw a dart, you can be fast. But how did you have a good decision, or a reasonably good decision, and were fast? And so that was really the focus of that paper, was seeing that practical problem. And in fact, we stumbled on it. This was actually, the original database was with Jay Bourgeois, and we intended to look at 90 companies in the Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area broadly, who were in the microcomputer industry. And it turned out the insights, at least to us, were so interesting that we stopped at 12. And our first paper was actually the one that Tony showed you, which was 4. So we started out sort of serendipitously even getting into case study research. And this paper, I think, had a couple of counterintuitive points. I'm not going to mention a lot of them, but I think that was one of the counterintuitive points in this paper, is that you make a faster decision when you actually have multiple alternatives, not one. Because people decide things faster in comparison than they do in depth. So that was one paper where I think we were lucky and we saw the phenomenon, we talked to the executives, and it was just so blindingly clear this need was relevant. This is a more contemporary paper that I just thought I'd mention. It's with Jeff Martin, and it's called Rewiring Cross-Business Unit Collaboration, and there's more to the title. But this paper very much came from the practical problem. Both Jeff and I knew from our work with companies, or in Jeff's case, being in companies, that cross-business synergy was very hard for managers to get their arms around. And yet, much of corporate strategy is being driven by the assumption that we're going to get synergy. So we're doing this acquisition because it's synergistic. We're diversifying this market because it's synergistic. So if you look at the justifications of many moves in corporate strategy, the justification is around synergy. But if you look at the reality, people weren't getting synergy. I mean, that's one of the reasons why acquisitions don't do well. People weren't getting synergies, and not only were they not getting synergies, they didn't even know how to get synergies. They just knew they should be. And so what we did, particularly, this is Jeff, looked at, first of all, what we did was we looked at the existing literature. And it was primarily around transaction costs. And it was primarily around CEOs and corporate executives have the broad purview and the incentives, and they're the ones who should drive corporate collaboration. But if you looked at the empirical results of those studies, they were pretty sketchy. The measures were not so good, the results were pretty low statistical power, and it sort of didn't give you a lot of comfort that that theory was really matching the data that was even in the studies. So what Jeff did in particular was both of us did, but Jeff did most of the work, looked at 6 companies in the software industry. Software, you may not have thought about this, but there are actually a lot of opportunities for cross-business synergy around bundling, around use of code. There's just lots of things you can do in software. So we looked at multi-business software companies, 6 of them. And each one, we looked at the collaboration that the executive said was a good collaboration and executive collaboration that the executive said was a poor collaboration. And what's interesting about that design is we're controlling for the people, because it's always the same people collaborating. And sometimes they do it well, and sometimes they do it poorly. And they can tell you which ones are good and bad, but they can't tell you why. Which was also interesting, because I don't think managers had the time to reflect that we did. And what we found in that study, I don't know if but it was pretty much a different point than what the literature said. That the best collaborations were not coming from CEOs. The worst collaborations were coming from CEOs. And because they were coming from CEOs, it drove a process that was largely dysfunctional. Well, if the boss wants it, we better do it, but we really don't. It's kind of like when your dean says, the strategy of the OB group should be collaborating with finance. You're like, oh, right, let's do something. Let's put somebody marginal on that project and let's do what we really do. And that was what these companies were saying. And so the really best collaborations were coming from the business units themselves realizing that together we can accomplish something we couldn't do alone. They are then more careful about what they choose as a collaboration, so they do more experimentation than what's driven from the top. They do more negotiating, and then at the end of the day, they put their best people on the project and set it off and give the kind of resources it needs. And so it was like a completely different view from this CEO knows all, you gotta watch those bad boy GMs. It was much more around, it's actually coming from GMs. And by the way, not general managers who are Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts in the sense of, gee, I really want to be pals with them. It was about self-interest. This was a project where I got something and you got something. And otherwise it wasn't worth their time. And so that was, I think, I thought a pretty interesting study that really got at a problem that executives do not know how to solve. And I'll just mention this is one last important practical problem, and I won't say too much about this, but this was the problem of particularly in many technology industries, but perhaps others as well. Lots of what you have to do in terms of R&D and innovation is actually going across companies. And yet again, what's the percentage of failed alliances? I'm not sure, but it's I think reasonably high. And so we felt cross-business collaboration is a business reality for a company like a Microsoft or an SAP or Hewlett Packard, Cisco or Intel or kind of any of I don't know the big tech world, but Johnson & Johnson in less tech world. Cross-business collaboration is essential for what you do, and yet the research that we have is primarily focused on antecedent conditions. So we know that alliances work better if you have alliance experience. Alliances work better if you are relatively equal-sized power partners. Alliances work better if you have an alliance function. So we know a number of the antecedent conditions, but we don't know when you actually get into the collaboration how to make it work. And so what, in this case, Jason primarily did, but I think both of us, but certainly Jason who was driving this, we picked companies and alliances where, from the antecedent conditions, these should all be winners. Savvy companies, done it a million times, have an alliance function, all that kind of thing. And we looked at some of their alliances that were good and some bad. Some of them even the same partners, where they worked well and poorly. And by working well, I think we had a particularly good dependent variable. We looked at, was the outcome of the R&D collaboration, did it have patents? Did it have products? Did it have products that had meaningful business success? Were people's comments about the alliance good or bad? And this was fantastic, or what a waste of time this was. So we had a really, really tight dependent variable measure. And what we found, just to say briefly, was we thought that some sort of consensual kind of relationship would be best going into this. And in fact, that's actually not true. What we found going in the big headlining point was in the title, that the key to the great alliances was rotating leadership. So Sarah works on it for a while, she flips it over to Anne. Anne works on it for a while, she flips it over to Sarah. And what that did was, when it was your turn, you ran it, and you had people from the other team, the other company on your team, you were taking the direction. And that worked for the second party because they knew they had their turn, which they then took it to another place. So what that did was it motivated the players. It also made, if you think from a search point of view, it was actually pretty clever from a search point of view, because you got a breadth of search because you had the two companies searching. But whenever somebody had the ball, they were going down a deep path in their own world. Plus, it was also keeping the freshness in the project so that you could change out the people as you got further along in the innovation. In contrast, what happened to the two other leadership styles, one of which was dominating the collaboration, and the other was being consensual. If it was dominance, it was fairly clear what was happening, is after a while, you really just get tired. Sarah gets tired of Anne telling her what to do all the time. And she kind of checks out. That was pretty obvious. The consensual was more difficult to see why that would falter. And what happened was, it was people trying to find the middle ground. It was taking a lot of time. Other people in the companies were looking and saying, I don't think I want to be there. It's too many meetings, not enough getting things done. We'd compromise in the middle and nobody would really be happy. And so the consensus, I think, was a surprise that didn't really work very well. Anyway, the point of what I'm trying to say is that in each of these three cases, whether it was how do we be fast, how do we get synergies, how do we do R&D collaborations, they were problems that real managers didn't know how to understand, didn't know how to cope with, and that when we looked at the literature, it wasn't really telling us the answer. So in the case of alliance literature, it was telling us the antecedent conditions, but it wasn't telling us the process. In the case of cross-business synergies, it was telling us a fantasy of how CEOs are doing one thing and other people doing another that didn't seem plausible because we knew CEOs were busy people, and it didn't seem plausible because the empirics didn't work. And so these were situations where the practical problem was sitting there, and our research was giving insight, but was not really giving any goods. Another source is the cool company. And I haven't done too much of this. I think Sarah's actually done more of this than I have, and Nikolai Solokow. But the cool company example, when there's some company doing something that is just really interesting and fascinating and looks well. And so this was a study that, actually there are several papers, right, and it's pretty cool in the AJ, but that Charlie Gelnick and I did. And the cool company aspect of this was this particular company had been the leading global technology-based company for 20, maybe even 30 years, for a long time. And it's very hard in the tech sector to stay on top for that long, and they were on top that long. And what were they doing? And Charlie knew a bit because he'd been doing some work with Bob Sutton, with them, in executive teaching and consulting. And they had figured out, they had seen this process that this company was doing, which they called charter change. And what it meant was business units had product market responsibilities, but those could move around. And so what they were essentially doing was they were adding divisions, changing divisions, they were adding businesses, ending businesses, combining them, splitting. And so they were moving around their mix of product market opportunities. And every quarter, the executives in this company, the senior executives, would meet, and they would plot what are the product market opportunities and where do we have businesses. And they'd look at whether the businesses were getting too big, which said to them, we need to split it. Whether there were overlaps, and they said, we need to divide that. And whether there were gaps, and that was where we had to fill. And so that was a really cool process, and I'm not sure there was another case to look at that. So here's the cool company example. What's this cool company doing? And that's what we did. And so this was actually Charlie's dissertation. And so we have a couple of papers where it's how they add businesses and how they take them away. And then we did some multiple cases with inside that company, but it was fundamentally about this company. And the story ends, with some pretty interesting processes, that there's a particular level of management where they are the ones who are crafting that moving around. And that the process was an interesting process that balanced economic factors, like we need to have the best business in this sector, with social factors, like if we take your business away from you, we give you a social safety net where you can still do well in the company. You aren't just permanently in the penalty box. And so there was a sort of balancing of economic reality with social sensitivity about how do you keep people still playing, even though you're in a fairly draconian way adding and cutting businesses. This paper, and I'm going to the next paper I'm going to talk about what it's like, this isn't explicitly a normative paper. So when the reviewers asked us to say something normative, we couldn't because it was this one company doing stuff well. So we tried to stretch it, but essentially our argument was, this is a good company, they're doing this well, we don't know if this is normative or not, but it sure looks like it. And so that's about as far as we could go through. But I think it was compelling that this was such an extraordinary company that there was something to say. I've also done this kind of research to come up with things that I think have had strategies, practice implications. And this is something I actually see Melissa in the audience, but this was Melissa's dissertation, Melissa Gravener. And this particular study came from Melissa, who had been engaged in the M&A practice at McKinsey, and so had seen what state-of-the-art M&A looked like. She'd also been an MBA student at Stanford, where a number of her friends had started companies and were able to sell them. And then she did a major literature review on the M&A literature in our field. And as she's looking at, I can't put too many words in her mouth because she's sitting here, but as she's looking at the M&A literature, and to some extent her McKinsey experience, and then looking at her friends, and here's the M&A literature saying, buyer wants this, buyer wants that, buyer is this, buyer's in control. And she's looking at her friends who have attractive companies to sell, where that's clearly not the case. Buyer is not in charge. Seller is saying no. Seller is making choices about which buyer they want. We just flipped the lens to see, well, what it really is going on, because it certainly may be the case that in distressed sales, buyer rules. But if it's a good company, which is often what one wants to buy, good companies don't have to go with you. It's like your prom date. If you're an attractive, nice person, you get your choice. And that was the way these companies work. They had their choice. And so what I think this did is really turned it around, and let's take a look at what the sellers have to say. And so the study design in this was 12 companies, three industry sectors, and in each, so that makes 4 companies. 3 of those companies were acquired, and a 4th company could have been acquired, and they chose not. As it turns out, when you actually delved into the data, some of the companies that were acquired either had choices or they had said no in the previous round. And so then we got into, particularly into some depth, in what was the decision-making process like. And it turned out, and I won't tell you all the details, and some of you may know them, but that sellers sell. First of all, I always ask my class this: out of 12 companies, how many companies shop their company and take the highest bid? Answer: none. They certainly are looking for money, and that's certainly a criteria, but highest offer, only thing they care about? No. Which always surprises the econ finance-oriented students. But what are our sellers looking for? First of all, one of the key insights is that sellers sell when they have a break in the action and they're thinking about it. So they sell when they're about to launch a product, they're about to get another run, these were entrepreneurial companies, get another run of financing, where they're going to change CEOs. But there was some sort of strategic break, and then they were open to being acquired. The other time they were open to being acquired, there was some sort of thing happening in their personal life. I borrowed money from my family and they want their money back. I didn't sell my company soon enough last time and I'm not going to let that happen again. Or my all-time favorite is, we had to move our company from California to Texas. It was so hot that my dog died. It was time to sell. So there was a very, how do you predict that your dog dying would matter? But the point of this was that there were very idiosyncratic reasons why people sold. And then there were very idiosyncratic reasons and interesting reasons that were non-economic, at least to some extent, to whom you sold. And so the point of my telling you this is that this is a study that took a topic like M&A that had been studied zillions of times, almost always from the buyer point of view, and turned it around, got some I think really outstanding granular data about what people's decision processes were from the buyer point of view, from the seller point of view, from investors, and came up with I think some new insights. The other paper I'll just bring up briefly on that one that I think is that is a new paper. It's actually a working paper. This is with Sam Garg, who's at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And this was again a paper where Sam read the corporate governance literature, knew the decision-making literature, and realized that most of that literature is from the owner and board perspective, and not really from the CEO perspective. And moreover, is assuming that CEOs are bad boy agents who you can't be trusted and you have to check up on, or they're somehow engaging in some sort of psychological or social processes. Let's say that Westfall would come up with. And we thought, well, maybe that's true and maybe that's not. But let's look at some boards and let's see how CEOs are actually trying to use their boards. And the interesting tension that CEOs face, at least we thought, from real life, is that CEOs want their boards to give them good advice. Well, actually, sometimes want them to go away, but that's not going to happen. So they want good advice, but they also want to look good. So how do you ask for advice and keep it look like you're in control and you know what you're doing? It's kind of a tension. You want to look commanding, powerful, whatever, but you also want advice. And how do you balance that? And so what we did is looked at, again, Sam Perry and all on this, looked at 4 companies, which seems at least pretty small. You know, I usually like to go bigger than that. And then obviously quant people like to go way bigger than that. But you know, it's hard to get into companies and go to board meetings. And Sam was able to go to multiple board meetings. Each of these companies probably 4 or 5 board meetings per company, which is very difficult access to get. And so we were happy with getting 4. He has questionnaires, interviews, the board meeting observations, and we're looking over time. Some retrospective data, but it's mostly real-time data. And trying to understand how CEOs are trying to manage their boards. The other thing that we did in this study that I think worked well is we chose first-time CEOs because we felt they wouldn't have a playbook for what to do. We wanted to see, because we wanted to have some variance. And so we thought we would be most likely to create variance if we had first-time CEOs. And so part of the story in this is first-time CEOs learning to be a CEO. In fact, it's not actually in this paper, but one of the things is it turns out that most CEOs will start with an analogy. Like one of them was a former McKinsey partner, and he started out with the analogy of, well, my board is like my client and I'm McKinsey. There was another guy who had been GM of a business unit in a big corporation, and he said, well, I'm a general manager and they're corporate. And had this analogy, that's how I'm going to start. It turns out neither of those situations is true, but it gives you a place to start. For example, in the corporate case, the board actually is less knowledgeable than corporate executives. The board is actually surprisingly not knowledgeable. As I see Sarah laughing, Shami's been down that road. Just to give you a quick overview of what the findings were, the primary finding I think that stands out for me is that as a CEO, you're better off thinking about your board not as a group, but a set of one-on-one relationships that you're managing. So even though you may have 6 board members or 8 board members, it's in fact that one-on-one relationship that you develop where you, on the one hand, get the advice, on the other hand, you retain the power. And that was the key for the ones who did well, was you gain the advice, but you control the power. And so one-on-one relationships let you do that. Another thing these CEOs would do was they would never go to a board meeting and present alternatives. They came in, here's my decision. And then debate my decision, and then you don't like it, I go back and I have multiple alternatives with my team, but I don't have them with you. And that was another way where they got the advice, but they maintained the control. Okay, so that's switching the lens idea. And then the final idea, so I've been in important problem, cool company, change the perspective, and this was taking a common process and what's really going on in that process. And this is the paper that Tony mentioned, the Bingham, the Rational Heuristics paper. And this paper, again, takes the point of view of there is a lot of research on learning, as we all know. And almost all of that research looks at some variation of experience and looks at performance and says, if performance improves, something must have been learned, and it tells me something about what experience I should have had. But it doesn't look at what I learned. And so this paper really went inside that black box, the learning box, and said, what is it that people are learning? By the way, what Chris and I learned from this was that even though we were now getting into Kahneman, Tversky, and Gigerenzer territory, it was hard to get this published in a psych place. Psychology people are intrigued by the paper, but at the end of the day, they can't go with our method. And so one of the lessons of this was, if you're in that psych world, which I think in strategy and practice you often are, our methods are not at the level of one might call anal or one might just call rigorous, but whatever term you choose to use, we don't usually meet that standard. And so we're better off getting them for insights, having lunch, getting good ideas, but publishing in our own world. And what the point of this paper was to really unpack a critical process that we knew a lot about at the ends, but didn't know the middle, and look inside and see what was up. So that's what we were trying to do with that paper. And I think we came out with, I think, some interesting ideas. One thing, by the way, I didn't say is back in the past, like when I did fast decisions, and even when Melissa and I did the seller story, the field was more forgiving about coming in with, that's interesting, not just writing. And the field is now much more expecting you to be grounded in the current research. So for example, the paper with Sam is very much grounded in corporate governance and strategic decision making. The paper with Jason is very much grounded in network theory. So you do have to be grounding in the theories in a way that we didn't used to have to do. We used to just be able to start with school and move on. And we can't do that anymore. This paper starts very much with the routines literature, with the knowledge literature. As we develop propositions, we're very much tying into some places cognitive diversity, some places cognitive psychology, some places good behavioral insights. This work, we're tying in to theories much more than we used to, both to set up the problem and to ground the results. And I think this paper, this is also a paper where, if you know my work, you knew that I was probably thinking I was going to find simple rules, which this paper is more like that than probably any other paper I've ever done. I thought I knew what I was going to find. But there were still surprises in the sense that we found that even, yes, we found that people learn heuristics, but we learned some really interesting things about the order. Some heuristics are easier and harder to learn. And we found some interesting things about heuristics change over time. How they start looking like the cognitive diversity world of pretty lousy heuristics to a much more strategic heuristics, small numbers. They keep small. In one sense, what people do over time if they pay attention is they keep honing those heuristics and they become more strategic and more varied in their abstraction. So we found something. Found something we thought we'd find. We also found some clues. And so overall, I guess that the point was, these are at least where I found ways that I think I've been able to, on the one hand, do research that gets published in top places and is pretty rigorous and pretty thoughtful, but on the other hand, is also speaking to managers and to real people in important ways, or at least I like to think in important ways. Now I want to just go ahead and now move to the future. A couple thoughts on methods for all of us. There was a time when building theory, and in cases, kind of my world, grounded theory, qualitative in general, however one wants to define that, we all saw ourselves as against the quant guys. And so we all kind of, maybe I didn't, like I was a reviewer on Jane Dutton's award-winning AMJ paper, and it wasn't the way I would have done a case, but it was a cool paper, and Jane and I were on the qualitative team. And not that I was letting Jane and Janet Dukeridge have an easy break, but they didn't have to be what I was doing. They could be them. And I think to some extent gotten away from that. And I think we all have to step back and say, the people we really have to convince are those crazy endogeneity quant people, and not our fellow travelers in strategy as practice. So I think we ought to keep that in mind. The other thing, I think there's a real opportunity for somebody, and I know Anne has done some of this, but to move even further of what are the different flavors of what we all broadly, which I do hate the term qualitative research because I think it's about data and this is about logic. But what we're all doing and when one would want to be interpretivist and when one wanted to be positivist and when one would want multiple cases and not. Someone who could really pull that together so we'd have a little bit more of a guidebook of what made sense when. The other point I just want to make is I'm not sure what the method is, but it somehow feels like there ought to be, and maybe I'm just not reading enough, and I don't know what they are. But the cases and the interviews and the qualitative in general, is there something else we could be doing? And I'm guessing that other people are finding those things, and I'm just not reading enough. But something about maybe going beyond just the kind of qualitative casey kinds of things we've done. The other thing is topics. I actually probably should reverse this order, but I don't know how many people are tired of dynamic capabilities. When Jeff Martin and I wrote that paper, I don't know how many years ago, we were already tired of dynamic capabilities. They were all right already, let's go in and talk about real companies doing real things. I think that's still true. I think you don't need one more real theory paper. What we really need is strategy as practice people going into real companies and unwinding an acquisition process, unwinding the alliance process, unwinding strategic decision-making in general. But so instead of talking about dynamic capabilities in some sort of abstract way, let's see real companies doing real things. And then finally, I think one of the most exciting topic areas is actually power and politics. Anybody who's in any kind of an organization that's bigger than 2 knows about power and politics. And yet, there is, I mean, Sarah's done some interesting things, but there aren't a lot of other people who've really jumped into power and politics. And that is so important in what happens in organizations. From a good point of view and a bad point of view. I think Jeff Pfeffer does a nice job of pointing out power in politics is a reality because people have different goals. And you have to deal with power in politics. It's not like only sleazy people do power in politics. You know, to get things done, you need power in politics. And I think we just don't know much of anything. So I think that's one of, in my mind, one of the big opportunities of power in politics. And then finally, I want to thank you all for coming. I hope it was interesting, and I appreciate you coming. I appreciate Strategies Practice nominating me as their distinguished speaker. It's really